Okay, so yun, after you have identified the persons at risk and identified the risk controls, you need to assess the risk using the risk matrix. And so this is, again, your risk is the likelihood that a hazard can cause a specific bodily injury. These can be determined by looking at the severity and likelihood. So when we talk about severity, it is the amount of damage or harm that a hazard could create. So depende ano ba yung pwedeng maging consequence nung hazard. So that will be your severity. Likelihood will be the probability of the hazard occurring. So that is likelihood. So this is the risk matrix that is usually used. So again, this is the one that we previously used in NUS. So you have this matrix of consequence versus likelihood. If you have a grading system actually, so if it's not likely to occur, then the score is 1. If it's possible, 2. Likely, 3. And then if the consequence is minor, then it is the score for consequence is low, 1. Kapag it's possible to have lacerations, burns, and other work-related injuries that are requiring medical treatments, that is considered 2. If it's something that can be fatal, life-threatening, or can cause permanent disability, then that is considered consequence score 3. And from there, you will be able to make use of this matrix. So kapag low yung consequence and likely, I'm sorry, I think, yes, yeah. So if your consequence is, uh, okay, it seems, yeah, okay. So if it's low consequence and likely, actually this one is this. Sorry, sorry po. So unlikely, pero low consequence, it will be considered 1. And kapag if it's possible and medium consequence, 4. If it's likely to happen and high consequence, it's 9. So actually ano siya? So 1, 2, 3 yung scoring, and then for you to get the risk, you just need to multiply. So unlikely tapos low consequence, that is 1 times 1, so equals to 1. So if it's, for example, likely 3 tapos low consequence, that is 1 times 3, so therefore the risk level is 3. If it's likely but medium consequence, so that is 2 multiplied by 3, so that is 6. So yon. And from there, you can determine what is the risk level and what is the decision process. So kapag yung less than 3 yung score mo for the risk, then it is considered acceptable risk. Kapag 3 yung score, it's considered that you have to add additional risk control. So it is suggested to add additional risk control. Kapag greater than 3 yung score, then additional risk control is actually required. So yon. So again, risk is equals to your likelihood multiplied by the severity. So again, this will be depending on the score that you get for the likelihood versus the consequence. Okay. So after that, after identifying the risk level, if needed, you might have to identify additional controls. So again, this is if the risk score is either 3 or 4 or 4 and up. So kapag 3 yung score, then it can be considered. So you can consider adding additional risk controls. Kapag higher than that, then you have to, or it is required that you add in additional risk controls. Again, number 8 is to implement. So it is important to make sure that we implement yung risk assessment. So hindi lang siya paper exercise. Para maging useful siya, para ma-ensure natin yung safety of everyone who is involved in the experiment or in the equipment. And yun, lastly, again, review and modify the risk assessment at regular intervals, for example, every 3 years, or if there is a change in process, kung nagkaroon ka ng change in equipment or nag-scale up ka, then you have to assess whether the risk control still holds, or if needed, you have to employ additional risk controls. Also, if there is an accident, then that means your risk controls is not sufficient, and therefore you have to review again the risk assessment and employ additional controls. Okay, so again, this is your risk management process flowchart, the different parts, and again, highlighting the importance of communication across the different steps of the risk management process. I will just briefly show you an example of a risk assessment. So this is an example of an experiment-based risk assessment for a particular part of that of my experiment. So for example, if I'm doing acid hydrolysis of dextran ladder, again, I have to specify the different steps. So kailangan talaga step by step siya. So yung mula pag-weigh nyo hanggang sa paglalagay nyo ng acid and so forth, kailangan step by step. And then you identify the hazards. So for example, the dextran ladder is considered not hazardous. And so wala siyang actually masyadong hazard except for like possible irritation coming from particulate matter. So that will be your possible accident. And then the risk control will be mainly to wear your PPEs. And yun. So yung risk level is low. So severity is 1, likelihood is 1. So actually, you can, again, do this in Excel sheet, and then you can, you can just put in the formula. So risk level is equals to severity multiplied by your likelihood. And then, if you have hazardous chemicals like these, HCl, you identify what is the hazard of that particular chemical. If you're working with solutions having multiple chemicals, then you have to enumerate yung iba't ibang chemicals dito. So one step can have multiple hazards, multiple chemicals. And then from there, you also have to consider ano-ano ba yung hazards for that particular chemical. So if, for example, if you have methanol, it is both flammable and toxic. So therefore, for that particular chemical, you will have to have 2 different risk assessments depending on the hazard. Also for this one, so as you can see from here, incubation of the mixture at 90 degrees for two hours. So you have to consider the hazard of working at high temperature, electrical hazard coming from the use of electrical equipments, chemical exposures, glass breakage, and this again has to be evaluated separately. So what will be the possible accidents? What are the risk controls that you can implement? And so paggamit ng PPEs, working under the fume hood, putting in place certain signages for those that are, for the others who are working in the lab, etc. And so again, you assess based on the severity and likelihood. So this will indicate who has performed the risk assessment, and subsequently it will be approved by your PI. And this again will have to be revisited every 3 years. You can also, for example, for steps wherein meron ka ng ibang risk assessment for that. For example, for the use of a freeze dryer, you have a separate risk assessment for that. And then, so for that part, you just need to refer them to the RA for the freeze dryer.